There has been a whole lot of conversations. I think there are a lot of folks that are very happy. There are some folks who think that it could look different for a variety of reasons. You know, the redistricting process is difficult, and that it's more than just your particular district. I mean, there are Department of Justice requirements, there are Voting Rights Act requirements. So it's a very, very difficult task to draw that map. So I think the general feel is people are still wanting to look at it some more.
You know, you probably know personally, I've decided I'm not going to vote on that. I'm going to abstain from not only voting on it, but from the whole process. Frankly, my feeling is with the budget crisis we're dealing with the challenges we face as a state, what the voters don't want their politicians doing right now is spending their time trying to save their own political skins by drawing a district they can be assured of winning in the next election cycle. I've always said it's an inherent conflict of interest for us to draw our own districts, and that the legislature shouldn't have the power to create these maps. I've always filed legislation to have an independent commission, a bipartisan commission, do this so that we're spending our time on the things that we should be spending our time on. This session of all sessions, I believe that to be true. To your question about the mood, I mean, you know, and this isn't to impugn any of my colleagues, but when you look around the floor of the House and you see people frantically clustered around maps trying to figure out how it affects them, and generally what they're looking at isn't, you know, does it preserve communities, does it subdivide neighborhoods that shouldn't be subdivided? What they're looking at is, how's it going to affect my reelection? And that just ought not be one of the things we spend our time doing, trying to rig the elections to preordain the outcome before the voters ever have a chance to cast a ballot.
Why do you feel like no one has gotten on board with this if you've filed legislation session after session?
Because it takes away their ability to rig the outcome of the election before the voters ever cast a ballot.
What do you think?
What I would add to that is that it is our duty every 10 years to address the issue. It's not my decision or Mark's decision. That is what we're tasked to do. I'm not going to abdicate that responsibility simply because I believe that we should or should not be in the process. The fact is that it's what we're asked to do, and it's what we're told to do. And so what you do is you engage. And what I need to do is make certain that the people of House District 52, and quite frankly all of Williamson County, is represented. So what we did was we worked very hard last Friday night, Saturday and Sunday, so not huddled around a desk, but actually worked over the weekend, even Palm Sunday, testifying in front of the committee. Because the map that we had worked on put together and kept all of our cities whole in Williamson County. Small part of Georgetown the exception. But we had 7 cities that had been split. 7. Cedar Park 3 times, Round Rock 3 times. We need to, as the representatives from that area, step up and make our cities whole. And we did that. It took us a long time, but now Taylor is whole, and Hutto is whole, and Round Rock is whole, and Cedar Park is whole, and Brushy Creek is whole, and Leander is whole. Without that, those cities would have been split. And you're looking at communities of interest that would have been so different than what they are now. The fact that Cedar Park was in the same district as Burnett County and Milam counties is unacceptable. But it took our efforts to step in and make sure Cedar Park is whole. And that's what we did. So it isn't just what we want to do, it's what we're tasked to do, and that's what we did to protect those cities.
It's true. We're constitutionally bound to redraw the districts every 10 years. It's necessary that they be reapportioned. I just don't think they should be reapportioned by us. Larry makes a good point. The work he did, and I watched it because he sits behind me on the floor, really does make the Williamson County map more rational. The Williamson County map that was in the original bill was almost, I would say, indefensible. And voters would have looked at it, and just by looking at it, you'd have said, this is an insane way to draw these maps. But at the end of the day, I think the voters can't have much confidence in maps that are drawn by the politicians who intend to run for the seats that the districts they created, for the districts they created. I think it's an inherent conflict of interest. I don't think we ought to do it, and I think that's especially true in a year when we have this enormous budget shortfall that we frankly haven't yet demonstrated that we've done a very good job addressing.
Well, we're talking about preserving those seats. It looks like things turned out pretty well for Travis County for incumbents. What do you think?
They did. They always do. That's the way redistricting works. There are some incumbents around the state who are dissatisfied with the maps just because the Republicans had such sweeping victories in the last election. There are now 101 Republicans to 49 Democrats in the Texas House. And it's almost impossible to draw a statewide map that preserves 101 Republican seats. So, you know, there were some incumbents who were not going to be happy with the maps, but for the most part, it was an exercise in trying to protect as many incumbents as possible, which I don't think ought to be the first priority of redistricting.
And I can tell you about House District 52 is that after we had looked at Southern Williamson County, and of course what we're doing in Williamson County affects 2 other counties. When we had finished with Southern Williamson County AC 52, it was less Republican than under the map that I had referred to that was split. But the priority was to make sure the cities were whole, to make sure the cities understood that we're trying to build them back together. So when we have the 36 letters from our city councilmen and our mayors, I asked them, please support us on making the cities whole, and they did. There were those who look at just raw numbers and kind of what their own district looks like, and I'll tell you that HD 52 is slightly less Republican than under the previous map, but more importantly, our cities are whole and our communities of interest are whole, and that's what we looked at from the very beginning.
I give you a lot of credit for that, although in fairness, it's slightly less Republican than in the previous map. It's a lot more Republican than in the current map.
That would be
concede.
true.
And that's the point, is
That would be true.
and so this speaks to the fundamental problem with redistricting, and it becomes a much larger issue than just this issue of self-preservation by politicians. What has really happened through redistricting is that the 2 parties have basically divided up the state and said which districts are going to be Republican districts and which districts are going to be Democratic districts. And it is in the interest of incumbents to make those districts represented by Democrats as democratic as possible, and those districts represented by Republican have as many Republicans as possible. The effect of that, and this gets to the very much larger issue of why Americans are so frustrated with their political representatives right now. The effect of having these districts that are not competitive in the general election, that are stacked for one party or the other, is that politicians then come to view their constituency as the members of their political party who live in their district. Because if you're in a 65% or more Democratic district, you're not going to get beat by a Republican in the next election. Your only risk of losing is losing to a Democrat in your next primary. And if you're going to lose in your primary, it's going to be from somebody who runs against you from the extreme far wing of your own party because you got out of line by not being true to your base. What voters generally want from politicians is more politicians who are willing to meet in the middle, more politicians who represent the broad centrist consensus of this country, more politicians who are willing to compromise with the other party and be part of a grand compromise. You can't do that if you're in a district that is 65% Democratic and your biggest fear politically is that a Democrat is going to run against you in your primary from your left. And the same goes of Republicans. So when you watch politicians today and you can't figure out why kind of obvious common sense centrist solutions are so hard for them to come to agreements about, it is because of that dynamic above all other considerations. It is because they have a political fear of reaching toward the center because the political system drives them toward the extreme wing of their own party. Lee Walker, who was CEO of Dell during some of the 90s, says that when you get problems that repeat themselves consistently, you can't blame people. Something's wrong with your system. And this systemic role that redistricting plays in making us polarized and partisan is one of the things that frustrates people most about American democracy.